Tonight, we welcome Dr. Sergio La Porta, who will be giving a talk on complicated communities in medieval Armenia, Christians and Muslims in conflict and cohabitation. I need to let you know also that this session will be recorded and made available on the Diocese of the Armenian Church in the United Kingdom and Ireland website. Sergio is the Haik and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies and Interim Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, California State University, Fresno. He received his PhD in Armenian and Near Eastern Studies from Harvard University in 2001, where he wrote his thesis on Grigor Tativatsi's Book of Questions. In addition to publishing a study on Armenian commentaries on the works of Dionysius the Areopagite, he has written articles on medieval Armenian intellectual history and cultural interactions with Islamicate, Byzantine, and Latinate worlds. Sergio served as the editor of the Journal for the Society of Armenian Studies from 2011 to 2020, and co-founded the Fresno Institute for Classical Armenian Translation with Dr. Michael Pfeiffer in 2018. So Sergio, over to you.
Thank you, Armenia, and thank you, Serpazan, for inviting me to speak to you this evening or this afternoon, my time. I'm in my office, and I apologize if you hear some rumbling. We're having major construction being done right outside my window. So, but I have my ear pods in and hopefully it'll work. I will share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint that I do want to share. And hopefully this will work if I can find it. Okay. And then hopefully we'll get the right view as well. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing just the title and nothing else. Is that correct, Armenia? Is that okay? Excellent.
Yeah, that's right.
So my talk today is on complicated communities in medieval Armenia, Christians and Muslims in conflict and cohabitation. And basically, I want to take a look at Armenia in the 12th century and Armenian society and Christian-Muslim relations and maybe in a smaller detail than is normally done. And what I hope to do is look at this question partially of religious identity in Armenia in the 12th century. And normally we look at it and we think of religious identity as monolithic, as rather fixed and antagonistic. That is monolithic in that there is one identity known as Christian or even Christian Armenian, but that is a position that is held by everybody who belongs to that identity. It is fixed in that it doesn't tend to move anywhere from there, but stays within that one position, and antagonistic, and that it is in contradistinction to other sort of religious identities. And therefore we have things such as Christian community versus a Muslim community, or Christian versus Muslim. And we see this also in notions of Armenia as an island of Christianity and a sea of Islam. And within this sort of paradigm of these monolithic religious identity blocks, normally Islam is associated with an aggressive sort of evangelical, so trying to convert other people to Islam as the politically strong factor in this dynamic, that it has military and political strength behind it to support its institutions and to encourage conversion, and that it's foreign. That is that the Muslims in general are not native to the area, but come from the outside and sort of infiltrate it or conquer it. On the other hand, Christianity, and particularly in Armenia, is normally seen as passive or defensive. And so we often see the phrase defending the Christian tradition, defending their traditional values. It's also considered often as weak, that it doesn't have a means of fighting back often against what is perceived as the strength of Islamic polities or armies. And so that we have sort of Islamic rulers and let's say Christian monks who don't obviously have the physical or military resources behind them, and that it's native, right? That Christianity in itself, that's what the population would believe if there was no other influence coming in from the outside to disturb that. And because of the way this is constructed, then these communities are seen as ultimately separate. Sometimes they're seen as, well, after a certain point, Muslim communities live within urban centers, but the Armenians and Christians lived in the rural areas. Even within urban centers, the cities were divided by quarters and they didn't really intermingle. They had very, very separate areas. They have separate educational institutions. They have separate religious institutions. And even though we know that they're living in the same general area, they don't necessarily overlap. And when they do, it's a discourse of violence that tends to dominate that sort of interaction. That is, when we talk about Muslims and Christians interacting in Armenia in the 12th century or 11th and 12th century, it's often in conquest narratives or narratives of persecution. And so I'd like to focus today on 3 stories that occur in Armenian literature, and hopefully at least shift some of those ideas. So here's a picture of the city of Ani, and here we have on the left, at least to my left, is the Mosque of, it's often called the Mosque of Miniature, for purposes here, we can call it that. Then the Cathedral of Ani, the Kadohike, and then finally Grigor Honens's church over there. And the 3 stories sort of relate to these buildings in one way or another. The 3 stories are the first one is Grigor the Claviger, who actually is from Ani originally. He's the holder of the keys to the Katolike. And then we'll have Yovsep of Dvin. He's what they call a neo-martyr, somebody who was martyred in recent history, but in the 12th century. And likewise another martyr, Khosrov of Ganzak, which doesn't happen near Ani, but I think relates as well to these other 2 stories. And what I hope to at least do is use them to destabilize these fixed notions of identity, to show that identity could be more fluid and contextual, as well as show that the communities in which these people operated were complicated. That is, Christians and Muslims lived an entangled existence, and there weren't neat dividing lines between them as sometimes we would like to imagine. So if we turn to a first example, that will be Grigor the Claviger. This story is reported in Vartan Ataveltzi's Universal Chronicle from 1268 CE. And Grigor is the keeper of the keys of the Cathedral of Ani. And there you see Ani circled on the map there. And he is on pilgrimage. And on his way back from pilgrimage, he's passing through the city of Dvin, and he passes as he's passing through the city on the outside. He passed a camp of what is called a fearsome crowd of Turks in their swarming camp. And so he goes into the camp and he cries out with a loud voice, "Blessed is Christ God, Son of God," which he had been accustomed to do daily in Ani. For his companion in prayer had as a jest whispered in his ears, "Behold, this is the place to bless Christ." Therefore they bound him and led him to Fadlan, and they put him in prison and intended to kill him there that same night on which they had arrested him. But that night, after he was arrested, Fadlan apparently experiences a terrible vision of men in the form of fire, pyriform men, coming out of the keys of the Cathedral of Ani, right? Because he was hoping to actually steal the items from the church. And here are some examples of what may have been in the Cathedral of Ani. So Fadlan wanted to steal these treasures from the Cathedral of Ani, according to the story as related in Vartan, but this terrible vision frightens him. And he's so frightened that he goes to Grigor and he prays, he asks him to pray for him, and then he frees him from prison the next day. Now, in Vartan's text, this is a somewhat confused story because it starts with Grigor being released from prison, and then it goes into the reason why. And so the focus is really on why he was put into prison, but the focus is really on why he was released from prison and why the valuables of the church had not been stolen. All right. So it's sort of confusing, but once we put it in the right way, it sort of makes sense. So on the one hand, it's intended to explain why the Cathedral of Ani had not been ransacked or harmed, when the city was surrendered by the Georgian monarchy to the Shaddadid Fadlun. But it also highlights other dynamics of local politics in the region, and an awareness of tensions between two different types of Muslims. So first, we may want to ask, what was Grigor doing in the camp of the Turkmen? And then secondly, why does Fadlun actually set him free? Right? I mean, we can believe that he has this vision and he does it, but I think there are probably other factors at play here. So first, let's look at what Grigor was doing. And one of the things we should know is that his name, at the outset, Grigor is reminiscent of Grigor Lusovoric, Gregory the Illuminator, who converted King Tirdat to Christianity early in the 4th century. Now, it's not just the similarities of names, because obviously the name Grigor and Gregory in Armenian is very common, but it is worth noting that Grigor, our Grigor the Claviger, was coming back from Khorvirap, where he was doing pilgrimage when he gets when he's passing through Dvin. So Khorvirap is the famous site where known as the Deep Pit, Khorvirap, where King Tirdat had actually imprisoned Gregory the Illuminator after torturing him for refusing to worship the goddess Anahid. Thus, our Grigor is returning from a visit to St. Gregory's imprisonment site when he himself is imprisoned by a ruler. And like St. Gregory, Grigor the Claviger is freed after a vision, right? So St. Gregory is freed after a vision appears to Khosroviducht, and eventually he's let out in order because he can save King Tirdat and heal him spiritually after he's converted to a boar for having killed Sipsime and Gayane. So the idea of both Grigors then is, or at least Grigor the Claviger, he's coming back from visiting Khorvirap, this place of imprisonment, and upon doing so, he himself is then put into prison and is released after this vision. Now, the parallels aren't exact, and they're details, obviously, but I think they're sufficiently analogous for anyone familiar with the Vita of St. Gregory to notice the connection. And so given these correspondences, the idea that, guy's name's Grigor, he's coming back from Khorvirap, he himself is imprisoned and then freed, right? I think that Grigor was actually going in amongst the Turkmen to proselytize them. That is, when he says he's going in and he's praising Christ God amongst this camp of Turkmen who are camped outside of Dvin, he is actually proselytizing to them, and not so much as just telling a joke, but actually trying to convert them. And this would obviously explain why they became so annoyed that they captured him and brought them to the local ruler. Now, why would the local ruler Fadlun, however, want to release him? First of all, we should notice that the narrative itself is circumspect about Fadlun's involvement in all this. Vartan's account ascribes all agency to the Turkmen, and it is they who bind Grigor and bring him to Fadlun. But the story also said it was they who imprisoned him and wanted him executed. And Fadlun is noticeably not directing the course of events here. And it clearly looks like he felt pressure from the mob to incarcerate Grigor and agree to have him killed. All right, so if he's facing that pressure, why does he eventually set him free? So although, according to Vartan, Fadlun himself had recently been living in Khorasan, his concerns were rooted in the region. And he had a Christian great-grandmother and grandmother. So Fadlun was the Shaddadid ruler of Ani and of Dvin at this time, and that from around 1125 to 1130. Right, and his grandmother and great-grandmother were not just Christians, but were actually Bagratuni. And Vartan notes that he considered, that is, Fadlun considered Ani his patrimony, and that he took good care of the city and its environs. Right, Fadlun therefore may have had personal reasons for sparing Grigor and a certain affinity for Christians that the Turkmen did not share. And indeed, one of Fadlun's younger brothers decided to convert to Christianity and became an ascetic. So here we have somebody who has local ties both to a powerful noble family as well as to the Christian community, whose younger brother converted, and now here he's faced with a a member of the, at least the lower hierarchy of the Armenian church, who's been grabbed by these Turkmen and being asked to execute him, right? Now, since this is outside of Dvin, but Fadlun ruled in both Ani and Dvin, and the demographics of Ani, which was probably still a majority Christian city, would also have favored a more lenient treatment of Grigor. And as we say, as Vartan says, Grigor had been accustomed to praising Christ daily in Ani, right? Reflecting Fadlun's acknowledgement of the local Christian power players. So urban inhabitants often played a decisive role in the political fates of their city. And it probably was not far from Fadlun's mind that his father's attempt to sell Ani to the Turkish Emir of Kars had been thwarted by its inhabitants, who invited the king of Georgia to occupy the city instead. We may have some sympathy for the sensitive position of Fadlun. Approached by his co-religionaries to execute a local clergyman, he seems to have successfully mediated the situation and released Grigor without losing his position. One wonders, however, when the Emir Kurti ibn Arslan attacked and killed Fadlun some years later in 1130, whether his forces included some of those same Turkmen. So he seems to have negotiated a temporary successful solution to the problem. But on the other hand, it may have come back to bite him, so to speak, in 1130 when it was invaded by Tukhan Arslan. Now, a couple of things, though, about this story that I'd like to point out is that Grigor initiates the action here, right, in terms of going out amongst the Turkmen. He's not asked to do so. We have no reports of him being told to do so. He sees this band of Turkmen and he goes out into that camp and starts to praise Christ amongst them on his own. It's clear that he has different interactions with the Turkmen and the Kurdish Muslims who are ruling in Dvin and in Ani. The Shaddadids are a Kurdish Muslim group who had been there for several generations. And they obviously had a very different relationship with Grigor than, or at least Fadlun did, than the Turkmen grab. So we can't see the Muslim community as a solid whole. There are differences even within that community as to how one would interact with members of the Christian community. Fadlun himself has a complicated identity. He could associate himself with Christianity or Islam as needed, depending on the context. And probably he was able to converse with Grigor on a very natural level, as well as he had to negotiate with the Turkmen horde outside. And we see the differences here even between cities. Both Ani and Dvin, or outside urban centers, they have different sensibilities. That is, that Grigor could act one way with Ani, but not necessarily be able to act the same way with Dvin. And it may also be the difference here of whether he's inside the city, where the populations may be more accustomed to each other, than outside the city, where it may have been more complicated because there was no history of that sort of interaction. And as we said, Fadlun is successful at negotiating at least a temporary solution as far as we can tell. We don't know how successful it is as a long-term solution because, as we said, he gets removed from power in 1130, and it may be possible that some of those same Turkmen who wanted Grigor dead were part of the raid later on in 1130 that removed Fadlun from power. So here we have one type of set of engagements, and this is really at an elite level with a ruler who has to negotiate between different constituencies in a complicated demographic and religious society. But we can also see these sorts of interactions and complicated relationships occurring at a lower level, at a more, let's say, on the ground level. And the next example that I'd like to talk about is the martyrdom of Yovsep of Dvin. He was martyred in 1170, so about 50 years later from when Grigor passed through Dvin, but in the same town or nearby the same town. This was quite a popular story. Already in his life, it was included within a homilary that's basically 15 to 18 years after his martyrdom. So his martyrdom achieved some early notoriety in Armenian circles. Likewise, an elegy was composed to him by a certain David the priest, whose exact identity is unknown, but who most likely flourished in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. And then two shorter versions that are slightly adapted of Yovsep's martyrdom also entered the Armenian Synaxarion, or the Heismavork. Now, and this is an image, a digital image from that Jarantir, or collection of choice homilies and lives of saints that's in the Matanadaran. It's manuscript 3777 from the late 12th century. You can see that's the beginning of the story. According to the story, Yovsep's birth name is Abu Bakr, right? And Abu Bakr's father was a Persian, it says, named Sevush, which is Siavosh. Could be Persian, could be Kurdish. It's not entirely clear, but he refers to them as Persian. According to the narrative, Sevush emigrated from his own country and settled in the town of Norashenk, which is right outside of Dvin, so not too far from the place where Grigor wandered into the Turkmen camp some 50 years prior. As I said, Siavosh is obviously a Persian name, but it is possible that he and his family were Kurds who migrated to Armenia. Now, one of the important things that the author of this, anonymous author of this story, points out is that his martyrdom is particularly important because this realm of the Armenians has long since become dry and thirsty for the dew of the blood of martyrs. Now it has become cool and quenched with the blood of this one. Therefore, signaling that this is not a common occurrence, what the story is about, that there weren't a lot of martyrs at this moment. Rather, this is an example in order to sort of fill out the need for martyrdom within Armenia, which is interesting in of itself. Although we do have other recorded martyrdoms from this period, it doesn't seem to have been as wide a phenomenon as maybe thought, at least according to this author. Now, when Abu Bakr was a young man, his dad sent him to school. It's probably not a madrasa, but more of a kitab. They sent him to a religious school, an Islamic religious school, and that was probably the one in Dvin, but he did not like his experience. He said that all sorts of sin was taking place, and he found the people filthy and disgusting. In the later Heismavork versions in the Synaxaria, they actually spell out that that there were acts of homosexuality occurring in the school, and that repulsed them, and therefore he decided to leave. He was subsequently educated. He sought out Christian teachers instead. And one can think of in Dvin, we know from the Arab geographer al-Muqaddasi that the central mosque, where it's possible the school was attached, and was right next to a church in the city. And it may be that it was very easy for him to sort of hear what was going on in the Christian school as well, and that sort of inspired him. But nonetheless, as he grew older, his desire to become Christian also increased, and he was tutored in the faith by what it said, Christ-loving men, and in particular, the story notes, a certain pious man named Sarkis. And this Sarkis supposedly lived in their house, that is Abu Bakr's and father's house, like a servant who helped cultivate his Christian faith. Now, the phrasing here is a little ambiguous. The compound word mishakabar is otherwise unattested. Mishak normally denotes a farmer or cultivator, but it can also mean a servant. The ending abar signifies in the manner of. The author continues a farming metaphor, explaining that Sarkis was the cause of Abu Bakr's turning to Christianity, and that the latter was, quote, obedient and compliant to what he said, like the earth which grows that which has been planted in it. And so, although the rhetorical desire to link Sarkis's role in Abu Bakr's house with his cultivation, of the young man is clear, it is not entirely obvious whether we are also supposed to understand Meshakabash in a more literal sense as that Sarkis was a servant of Savush, or even possibly some sort of tenant farmer. But whatever the situation may have been, it is clear that the author is indicating that a Muslim and a Christian could share a single inhabitation and were able to develop close relationships, because he says that Sarkis did live in their house, and it's clear that he was able to teach him the basics of the Christian faith. Now, Abu Bakr is unable to withstand his yearning for Christianity any longer, and he decides to leave his parents and his home. He doesn't feel that he can continue to grow in his Christianity while he's at home, and so he slips away one night, and the narrative says that he goes to the region of Vaspuragan, to the region of Lake Van, and probably just near the town of Bakr. But his father, doesn't give up on him and follows him there and convinces him to come home. He says, "Don't worry, you come home, just come back. We miss you at home. We want you at home. You'll be able to do whatever you want. You'll be able to practice Christianity if you want to. We'll just keep it a private affair." But once Abu Bakr comes home, it becomes clear that his father has no intention of allowing him to continue to be a practicing Christian. And according to the text, his father has him bound in chains and summons the local religious leaders to talk his son into remaining a Muslim. And after he refuses their arguments and threats, actually some of Abu Bakr's close friends, and that's what it says, it's some close friends whom he says are ignorant priests, right? This is how the text describes them. Close friends of Abu Bakr, or ignorant priests, come to try to persuade him to dissimulate. That is, to do what his family and the community leaders ask, and then go somewhere else to practice his Christianity. And this is, we see this in some of the other martyrdoms too. They say, listen, just tell them, yes, you'll be a Muslim, then we'll get you out of here. You can go to Georgia or somewhere and be a practicing Christian there. But in any case, these priests are saying to him, listen, just pretend to be a Muslim and you can continue to practice your Christianity. And at first, Abu Bakr thinks this is a good idea, right? He says, hey, why not? That makes sense. So he says, fine, I'll do that. But once he is free, he regrets the compromise he made, and he secretly leaves his home once more. And it's at this point that Abu Bakr adopts the name Yovsep and writes to his parents, exclaiming, I am a Christian, right? And the famous Christianus Sum in Latin, or Christiana M in Armenian, as it says, the famous slogan of early Christian martyrs, right? Yovsep lives as an ascetic without provisions and clothing for 2 years, and does not receive any assistance from local monastic communities. And the story follows him around as he ventures from renowned monastery to renowned monastery, and continues to be rebuffed. That is, he gets there and they say, no, we don't want anything to do with you. One of the places he goes to is the renowned monastery of Hakhpat. They're like, no, we don't want really anything. You can't come in here. He said, nonetheless, he perseveres in his asceticism and continually listens to the lives of the saints and the trials of the martyrs. The author asserts that the reasons the monastic communities reject Yovsep are that they are worried that he was a fraud, and they feared reprisal from the authorities for harboring a convert. Something that we would sort of understand, that they thought like, maybe he is some sort of spy. He's not really a Christian. He's just saying that. And then in any case, if the authorities come by and figure out that we're harboring a convert, we're going to get into trouble. But Yovsep's wandering and rejection by the monastic community marks a critical juncture in the text. It is sandwiched between two instances when he makes the martyr's declaration of I am a Christian to his family. The first time is in the letter that I just mentioned, and the second is in person when he returns home and the story of his actual passio, the actual martyrdom, begins. The journey thus witnesses his spiritual growth from an interested convert to one fully devoted to the Christian faith. And it is only now that the author compares Yovsep to other martyrs. The narrative recounts that after Yovsep was refused entrance into a monastery, Satan persecuted him, quote, for he appeared as the second Vahan in our day. The reference is to the famous martyr of the 8th century, Vahan Gochnetzi, who was converted to Islam as a child, but reconverted to Christianity and was martyred. Subsequently, Yovsep conceives the idea of making pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Nothing is actually, it's unfortunate, nothing's actually reported about what he does in Jerusalem or even about the journey to Jerusalem, what he does there, except that on the way, he stopped at Mount Sukavet in the province of Bagravand in order to receive assistance from ascetics there. Now, Mount Sukavet is significant because it is associated with the cult of the Sukiasyank martyrs and the earliest strands of Christianity in Armenia. Sukias and his followers were Alans, related to Queen Satanik, the wife of King Artaxerxes of Armenia. They converted to Christianity and were murdered in the 2nd century CE. Their bones were reportedly found by Gregory the Illuminator, who established a martyrium for them at that spot. Through the comparison to Vahan and the allusion to the Sukiasyank and Gregory the Illuminator, Yovsep thus enters a constellation of figures associated with apostasy, conversion, and martyrdom. So the story as it appears thus highlights the entanglement of Christians and Muslims in the region of Dvin, right? And the pressures that conversion exerts on family and community, and the different attitudes of the various Christian figures in the story. So we have first of all, the idea that martyrdom is not common, which the author explicitly says this is and that's what makes it exemplary. We have competition between Christian and Islamic education as well. This is some of the social pressures. And this is a picture of a mosque and a church in Kosovo actually being put right next to each other, but we can sort of picture a similar situation in Dvin, likewise also with the schools, right? And Christians and Muslims living close together, even in the same house. But we have these different Christian positions, I think, that are also important, right? We have those Christians like Sarkis, who lives in the house, right, who engage in outreach, right, looking out and saying like, oh, you're interested in Christianity? Here, let me teach you about it. So that's one position. We have another position, sort of like the middle road, is that of dissimulation of those priests, his close friends who said, just pretend to be a Muslim, and then you can practice Christianity in secret. And then we also have the outright rejection of any sort of attempt to reach out to the Muslim population. That's exemplified here by the monastic elite, them wanting nothing to do with this because of the problems that it may encounter. But what I find significant in this is that we see both, on the one hand, the entanglement between the Christian and Muslim communities, and then a variety of Christian attitudes towards that entanglement. There isn't one response to the interactions that happen between Christian and Muslims from the Christian position, but you have various different responses to that. So if in Grigor the Claviger, we saw different responses on the Islamic side to interacting with a member of the Christian hierarchy. Here we have different Christian positions in their interaction with a Muslim community. Now, the final story that I would like to look at today is that of Khosrov of Ganzak. It happened in about summer of '67, great summer, and just a few years before Yovsep's martyrdom. And it's found in the story is found in the same manuscript, again, M377, should be the 88. So his story is also included there. There was also a separate elegy composed for him, but this time it was by Mechitar Ghosh, the famous Vartapet, the famous monastic teacher and codifier of Islamic, of law, not secular law, but close enough, who died in 1213. And the story was also included in the Synaxarion as Yovsep. So it was quite popular. Khosrov himself achieved some sort of cultic status. The actual motivation for the composition of this martyrdom was from the translation, somebody who witnessed the translation of his relics. That is, they dug up his relics and they created a martyrium for him outside of Ganza. And the person who wrote the martyrdom says that he probably was an eyewitness to this translation, And what occurred then inspired him to write this down. So if we want to talk about the story itself, it says that a Muslim girl was discovered by her father to be pregnant. Upon being beaten, she said it was Khosrov, a Christian neighbor, who had impregnated her. The boy was taken to court, where a judge ordered that he be thrown in prison. After a month, the judge had him brought before his parents, who begged him to plead for mercy in front of the court. The young man refused, and the judge put him back into prison for 8 more days, and then without food, and advised him again to convert to Islam and marry the girl. And indeed, his parents encouraged him, just marry the girl, convert, marry the girl. And some of this is standard tropes. He'll get a lot of money. The judge will make sure that he's well taken care of. But Khosrov again refuses. So finally, the judge orders him to be bound, paraded through the city in front of the populace, and to be stoned to death in the public square. After his death, a rope was tied around the boy's neck, and he was dragged outside the city through the Christian streets, and his body was burned. His parents collected the body and buried him in the communal Christian cemetery. Of course, the narrative does not accept the girl's accusation that Khosrov impregnated her, but informs the listener that she had been raped by her own half-brother. When she found out she was pregnant, she was afraid that her parents would kill her. And since she had always desired the beautiful youth, Khosrov, whom she used to secretly meet and converse with, which is also interesting in of itself, but who never acquiesced to her desires, she decided to blame him, thinking that he would convert and marry her. So we have a young Christian boy, a young Muslim girl. They're supposedly meeting and talking. She wants to marry him. He doesn't want anything to do with her in a sexual sense. She comes up with this idea, after being raped, she comes up with this idea to trick him into marrying her, but he refuses to convert and so is martyred. Now, that's the basic story, but the author of this story also underlines interesting communal dynamics while relating it. So if we look at Khosrov's community, Khosrov was from the town of Arkhanashen, which is a suburb just outside the city of Ganzak. And according to the author, the city was half Christian and half Muslim. He says it was exactly half-half. I mean, I presume that was, even an approximate, but still it was half Christian, half Muslim, and that they were friendly with each other physically, or ustmarno, according to the body. That means that there was no physical violence happened with one another. They got along, even if they were different spiritually and let's say in virtue or according to like practice. Physically, at least, they treated each other well. And indeed, it seems that Christians and Muslims lived right next to each other, as Khosrov and the girl were neighbors, and she frequently saw him going in and out of his home. And of course, as it said, that they used to meet together secretly and talk to each other, right? So there was a physical, a civil and respectful interaction between the two communities. Khosrov and the girl are neighbors. However, the proximity of these two communities, and there is an emphasis on the proximity of these two communities early in the martyrdom. So when he's laying out Khosrov's community, however, this starts to bifurcate or to move apart as we follow Khosrov's imprisonment, trial, and execution. And this is a mosaic of Saint Mark being dragged through the streets. That's from a church in Cairo, Coptic church. That's the picture. But so we see on the one hand, obviously, Khosrov is accused of impregnating the girl. And from that moment on, we start to see this split. After Khosrov refuses to convert one final time, the judge orders him, as I said, to be paraded, bound through the city in the view of the general populace, and then to be stoned, right? And we can start to see really that the two populations begin to bifurcate, not just in space, but also in their roles in the narrative. So while the Muslims now become the actors in the martyrdom, the Christians become spectators. The Muslims drag Khosrov out of the city to be stoned. Christians sneak out of the city in order to watch the martyrdom. The judge then orders his body to be dragged through the square outside the city to the streets of the Christians. right? Again, this may reflect an actual difference between the social composition and urban layout of the city of Ganzak, because it's now in Ganzak, and those of the suburb of Arkanishan. But I think more as a narrative technique, it starts to foreground the boundaries and divisions between the Muslim and Christian communities that had formerly been mixed. So if we're looking at the beginning of the martyrdom, we see there's a lot of this live next to each other, half. But as we get to the end of the martyrdom, we start seeing Christian quarter or Christian streets. We see inside the city, outside the city, Muslims doing this, Christians doing that. And we see that real, those boundaries starting to erect. At the same time, the martyrology presents a series of boundary transgressions. So whether it was the girl's half-brother or whether it was Khosrov, whether the girl's accusation was true or false, multiple community boundaries have been breached, right? This is depicted in the very acts of sexual violence and accusation, in Khosrov's parents' violation of their parental and legal duty not to betroth their child to a Muslim, as well as topographically. When Khosrov is dragged and people follow across and outside the city limits, and again through the square and out to the streets of the Christians. Even the place where the stoning occurred is a liminal transgressive space. He is taken to a rocky place to the bank of a river that had dried up. So on the one hand, there should be water, but there isn't any. And a river itself is usually a marker of a border, right? Which itself has ceased to function because it has no water. Instead, it is the stones that poured over the saint like drenching rain, which provide the ultimate boundary between this world and the next. So we see, on the one hand, the author carefully constructing through the martyrdom these boundaries between the two communities, and also how what is going on violates these boundaries. So on a very basic level, we can read Khosrov's martyrology as a cautionary tale, as one that enforces boundaries between communities, the notion that high fences make good neighbors. It further encourages the audience adherence to one's faith in the face of threats, worldly inducements, and death. In other words, stay on your side of the fence, no matter how greener the grass looks on the other side, because when that boundary is crossed, things fall apart and violence ensues. But it should be recalled that what prompted the author to write his martyrology was not the martyrdom itself, right? So it wasn't the actual martyrdom that made him write, but what happened 2 years later, following the translation of his relics, of the martyr's relics, which the author himself witnessed. The first testament to Khosrov's sanctity was that as they removed the body from the tomb, neither the bonds on his hand nor a hair on his head had been burned. Remember, it said that it burned the body, but he comes out completely unburned. Then, once he had been placed in the martyrium, an amazing vision of light appeared over his relics that was apparent not only to believers, but also to infidels. And this apparently happened during Ramadan in 1170. And one night when a local muezzin went out to a high flat place to summon everyone to prayer, he, quote, saw a miraculous sign over the tomb of the holy martyr, a severe light which surpassed the sun in its illumination. And seized with awe, he was not able to speak at all, but fell down half dead until the morning. The next day, the Muslim inhabitants went to him to ask what had happened, as they were counting on him to get them up. He told them about the vision, and they went to the judge to relate what he saw. The judge sent a servant to keep vigil in order to determine the truth of the matter. The servant came back the next day trembling in awe of the miraculous vision of light he saw. So there is an acknowledgement by the Muslim community of the sanctity of Khosrov himself. At the same time, some Muslims went to the mulberry tree where Khosrov had been tied before he had been martyred, right, to cut it down in order to burn it. They needed firewood. And a priest saw them and gave them wood to burn instead. And he took the tree himself. So they accepted the chopped wood that he had, and he took the mulberry tree himself. He then put the tree in the narthex of his church and carved it into the shape of a cross. And the story says many people, both infidel and Christian, were healed by the wood and the bark of the tree. And this is just a picture of some nice people gathering olives by tree. It's not olives, they're just playing by a tree. Now, obviously, some of this is a martyrological trope. The truth of Khosrov's sanctity is vouchsafed by the very fact that infidels attested to it. And this is common in a lot of martyrologies. But I think a bit more may be hinted here. We see how the same Khosrow, who has ruptured this community that has been friendly and loving to each other physically, literally in the body, Usmarno, now through these miracles brings them back together spiritually. The author remarks that through the martyr, the Lord healed many of the infidels and performed many healings of the blind and other ills, quote, for his glory and in thanks to the martyr. So these healings would have been as much and probably more spiritual than physical. That is, they caused people to rethink their relationship. They may have converted to Christianity. A common metaphor for conversion is that of spiritual healing. And therefore, it is only through the transgressive figure of Khosrow that this apparent harmonious community, friendly at the physical level at first, can be transformed into a spiritual community, united through acceptance of God's power operative in the martyr. So in conclusion, we can see that there is a complicated coexistence at various levels in the society of the 12th century between Christians and Muslims. Violence is indeed a part of life, right? I mean, the Middle Ages was violence was endemic to this period of time, and this, I'm not trying to put a rosy picture on things. There was lots of violence between both individual Muslims and obviously political groups, but this was not the only part of its life. Systemic persecution does not seem to have been that common. That is not to say people didn't kill, but there does not seem to be outright policies of martyring people. We may notice that even in these martyrdoms, nobody associated with the person gets martyred as well. So they're not part of a larger persecution. They're individual acts that are also built on, particular fault lines, right? So what I would say is that they enjoyed a fragile modus vivendi, and these fault lines are, fairly easy to spot. They have to deal with conversion. Obviously with Grigor trying to convert Turkmen to Christianity, or with Yovsep, in which he actually is a Muslim who converts to Christianity. That's a fault line. Or another one, obviously, is with sexual transgressions, or the idea of a sexual transgression, which is obviously going to cause communal tensions. So there is that modus vivendi is fragile. It can be broken, but I think the story of Khosrow shows that it can also be healed. It's not a permanent rift between the communities. They're able to come back together over the martyr himself. And then finally, we have to look at the fact that the expression of Christian and Muslim identities was variegated. There isn't just one way of being Christian or thinking of oneself as Christian or Muslim in the in this period in the 12th century in Armenia, and it was expressed in different ways, whether it was somehow through outreach, positive outreach towards Islam in terms of engaging with them in a way of even trying to convert them. Sometimes it was this idea that one could practice one's faith separately in secret, and sometimes it was a complete rejection. But there's not one single response that we can identify as the Muslim response. And we may also, the Christian response. And likewise, on the other side, there isn't just one Muslim response. The Muslim actors in these stories also play different roles, sometimes trying to help the convert to Christianity to get to a safer place, sometimes trying to encourage them to return to Islam, and then obviously acting as an executioner as well. So these characters are multifaceted. But the other aspect of these stories that I really appreciate is they also highlight that there may have been a difference between what was going on at a higher level, whether that's at the church hierarchy in particular, where you have the monastic elite wanting really nothing to do with this, and then at the popular level, where actual day-to-day interactions may have required a bit more flexibility. They may have been more fluid in some instances, and that people felt more comfortable engaging in an evangelical form of Christianity than possibly the established hierarchy did. I think I will end it there, and we'll open up to any questions if people have them. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much for coming and giving a talk, and it's been a really wonderful evening. And thank you everyone for coming as well. Okay.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.